So I'm sorry it's online. It's always a bit uncomfortable. It's good that at least I see one room with actual people in it, or an actual room with people in it. But so it's often less interactive, but please do feel free to interrupt me, ask questions during my presentation, especially if I'm using terminology that not all of you are familiar with. I don't want to be this person who talks and nobody understands. So I do want to talk about solidarity, and this is kind of a theorizing about solidarity, but it's also based on, I just realized, more than 10 years of empirical research. So I'm going to present something about something that I find very timely in the current turbulent political era, in an era where we are losing solidarity in many ways in various societies and globally. And so it's a kind of a critical view on social psychological approach so far on solidarity, but it's also based on a lot of empirical research that my team has conducted, a lot of it together with your institution. So yeah, and I put here a little bit of a picture, so you know this is, you are at the right place if you're joining online. This was the call. I can't decide so far if I'm preferring the professoressa or the professorka. They both sound very nice to me in your call. Okay, so let's move to the main concern or the main problem. So while we know that solidarity is based on a very, very deep-rooted universal cultural norm of helping, and that's why I put here the parable of the Good Samaritan, which illustrates how deeply rooted this phenomenon is. We also know that solidarity is kind of the bedrock of social cohesion. And by social cohesion, what I mean is that to live in a society when there is some basic level of solidarity among the citizens, where there is a care for everybody's well-being, and it creates some level of mutual trust. There is some recognition of shared values, even if it's just very basic. It creates a sense of belonging, and it generally contributes to the overall stability and functionality of a society. So when there is no solidarity, or solidarity is severely hampered by societal divisions, it leads to the deterioration of democracy and as society as such. So I'm taking this very fundamental perspective here on social cohesion based on solidarity. And the reason I put the picture of Bishop Marianne Edgar Buddy here, I don't know if you remember, it was not a long time ago at the inauguration of Trump. She gave a speech and she literally asked Mr. President, have mercy on people, vulnerable groups like immigrants, LGBT people. And this is precisely what she referred to. She explicitly stated, if you have no mercy on vulnerable, on people, members of vulnerable populations, this will lead to the deterioration of society. This is the end of America. So she had this very strong view that there is a direct connection between the loss of solidarity and the loss of society's basic functionality. So this is kind of a very basic, not social psychological understanding. And the reason I'm talking about it is because social psychology has largely neglected the goal of social cohesion, and they did so in favor of social change. And I'm going to explain that in a moment. But let's first talk a bit about solidarity, or why it's a social psychological phenomenon at all. Well, first of all, while I started with the Good Samaritan, so pro-social behavior, helping, solidarity may reflect this universal social norm. So it's our prerogative to help others. We do not extend our solidarity to everyone. First of all, because of some really basic psychological processes, there is a limit to who we can help. We can't help all the people in the world who need our help, right? So there are some basic psychological reasons for that. For example, there is a limit to our empathy. We can't empathize with all the suffering, with all the people of the world who are, in distress or suffering. So we learn to down-regulate our empathy, to focus on a limited number of people. That's the main reason when a charity organization will not tell you that thousands of 10,000 children are starving, but they would tell you the story of one individual child starving, because that's much more likely it would evoke your empathy than understanding that everybody's starving. There could be economic calculations in helping. We know it's costly. We need to consider where we want to spend our resources. And then sometimes we say, no, it's not worth it. Or we fear that it could be, we can get into trouble, or we can, the threat. I put threat perceptions here to refer to the fact that helping others, people who can actually physically or economically or culturally threaten us, that may be frowned upon by others in our people around us and so on. Or we can be literally afraid that they will use this power that we give them through helping to create a danger for us. So there could be some really simple reasons, but all of this tend to create a conditionality of helping in general, but specifically to members of other groups. So this creates, of course, there's some conditionality to in-group helping as well, but we are much more likely to help members of our own group, people who are close to us, people who are similar to us, than those of others. So we apply these specifically or more strongly when it comes to cross-group helping and not helping people of our own. And another aspect we have to consider, and this becomes a strong issue, that every helping relation is asymmetrical. There is the helper who has resources, who has competence, who has something to share, and there's the help recipient who's somehow lower in status, lacking the capacity, lacking the resources, and that's the main reason we need to help them. And while helping can be very beneficial in these asymmetrical situations to alleviate the suffering of the other, it also reinforces these status differences, because through helping, we establish that we are the ones who are capable of helping, and you are, or the other party is the one who's not, who's the low status. And because this is the case, people can engage in helping precisely to serve these status differences, so through self-serving motivations. Not to mention that helping itself is extremely rewarding. So there's a lot of benefits of helping. So there could be many reasons that are selfish in engaging with helping. So it could be status related, but also just for the rewards of helping through egoistic means. So, okay, this brings us to the question, what type of solidarity do we need in society? We see that there's a conditionality in cross-group helping. We see that this is asymmetrical. So basically, we can distinguish between the type of help, that I would call social cohesion-oriented helping, which is about the benefit of every member of society, without any regard to status differences and other issues, or we are engaging in the type of solidarity, or we need a type of solidarity that deals with these problems, the conditionality of helping or the asymmetrical, and wants to change that, wants to address that, wants to consider that. And while both represent ideas about, creating better societies, they can look very, very different. They can have very, very different goals and very different outcomes. And I have a systematic kind of overview of the main differences. But I want to add in advance that most of the times these two things go together. It's not an either or. In most real life situations, when you engage in one, it's much more likely you would also engage in the other. Yet we can recognize some really big differences. Social cohesion is any kind of pro-social behavior that has the aim of benefiting all or any member of a society. So whoever needs our help gets our help. Social change-oriented solidarity is directly about changing status relations. The status relations I mentioned that were originally asymmetrical in the helping relations or got reinforced through the helping. It's also a different type of activity. So, when we talk about social cohesion and that type of solidarity, it's more about direct helping. And in the social psychology literature, most of you or many of you are definitely familiar with that. We would consider this dependency-oriented helping. So rather than giving people the tools to change their own situation, we give them a solution to their problem. So it's about giving okay, so maybe on a social policy level, it would be about, or well, it's about charity or it's about aid rather than giving like further education or training to be employed in another situation. So that would be the comparing dependency-oriented helping to autonomy-oriented helping, which is more likely to be connected to social change, which is about giving the tools to change their own situation. And in fact, when we talk about volunteerism and donations, most likely, or charitable actions, that would be connected to social cohesion. But when we talk about protest participation or any kind of political or politicized action, that's more likely to be associated with social change. Okay, the target groups tend to be also quite different. Social cohesion, when we think of that type of solidarity, we have a tendency to think of economically marginalized groups. And for social change, we think about rights, representation, so more for politically marginalized groups. And indeed, there is a very big difference in how power relations or status relations are considered. Social cohesion, they remain unchallenged. When it's solidarity for social change, that's precisely what we are challenging. And in terms of the emotional background, we do see some similarities. You can engage in social cohesion-oriented solidarity with empathy because you feel sorry for people who are suffering, lacking something, and you can feel empathy for people for when their rights are violated. So both times you can feel empathy. However, additionally, when it comes to social change, there is usually also people tend to be very angry at the injustice. So they differ in terms of the target groups, the motivations. Actually, we see a lot of differences, right? Okay, but now I'm coming to the critique. Is this clear so far? Okay. So I'm building on two main lines of research, and I'm also criticizing two main lines of research, especially in how they treat social cohesion. One line of research is what I termed here the demobilizing effect of intergroup contact. This has been dominating the field since 2009, since these two papers were published that I put there, and have created a very strong critique of any kind of social psychological interventions, especially intergroup contact interventions that focus on harmony. Basically, what this Wright and Lubensky paper suggests, actually extremely, this is like the most important paper for me, is that, social psychology had been concerned with prejudice reduction and with advantaged group members. However, for social change to happen, first of all, we have to consider disadvantaged groups, and we need to see that conflict needs to be at the foreground. So when we are when we are engaging with interventions that create harmony in society, we are only serving social cohesion goals. If we want to serve social change goals, we have to see the conflict. The conflict needs to be out there, and intergroup contact can become this problem in recognizing the conflict from the perspective of disadvantaged groups. And this is also what other papers suggested, that it sedates people, harmony has an ironic effect of, disadvantaged group not recognizing their disadvantages or at least not speaking up against it, and so on. So this highlights the perspective of the disadvantaged group, and it's extremely important, but it has put intergroup contact and any kind of social cohesion-oriented solidarity into this problematic group. Okay, the other line of research I'm building on is this concept of strategic allyship, which I already mentioned, which is focusing on allies, and it grows out of the recognition that not all allies contribute to social change equally. For example, some of them engage in benevolent kind of support that's not addressing social change. Some of them would be driven by self-serving motivations, only to feel better about, you don't want to experience that others are suffering. It's also unpleasant, and you want to reduce that. Or it would be a performative allyship, kind of when it's normative to stand up for the rights of certain people. It looks great on a selfie, on the social media. So you would be more likely to engage only for the benefit of yourself. Okay? So these two lines of research are highly critical of any kind of effort that is for social solidarity effort that is really about social cohesion and not so much about social change. But really, what is the relationship between solidarity for social cohesion and solidarity for social change? And I'm going to present a number of different research results. Most of them, or all of them, are surveys, if I'm correct, that seek an answer to this question in comparing different actions, in comparing different motivations, in comparing different intergroup contexts, and in comparing different outcomes. And it's not a systematic line of research. Don't imagine that for 10 years I've had this really systematic research program proving this. No, it wasn't like that, unfortunately. I should have planned better. Retrospectively, I recognize that in every research almost, I've been searching for that. So I'm starting with the one that is most directly about this question, and it's kind of a complicated setup, and I hope I can explain it in an understandable way. So please ask questions if you can't follow, which I would totally understand. So this was a survey study. We started many years ago. I'm not even recalling the date of it, and we collected data in Hungary and in Norway. It was kind of a chance thing. And what we wanted to compare is different actions people take, different actions that are quite typical to social cohesion or that are quite typical to social change. For example, an action would be, I would write a letter to a politician asking them to support an organization that supports people living in extreme poverty. Oh yeah, so the study context was fighting global poverty, okay? So that's a typical social change action. Writing a letter to a politician, it's very confrontational, it's and so on. The other action types were like, I would do volunteer work for an organization that supports people living in extreme poverty. That would be typical solidarity action for social cohesion. Okay, so that's action. And then we had the goals. And the goals were, it was a bipolar scale. So every time you read about an action, you could decide, would you do that for this purpose or that purpose? And one purpose was social cohesion. So that organization was providing food, shelter, and medicine to people, poor people, or that organization was pressuring governments to commit to more generous aid and trade agreements. That would be social change, right? So we have actions and we have goals. And let's see how they work together. And then we conducted this latent profile analysis, which basically creates typical profiles of respondents. And what you see, putting together the 4 social cohesion action, which is volunteer work, donation, mobilizing community and fundraising, or social change action, writing petitions, signing letters, posting on social media, or engaging in protest. So these were the 2 types of actions. And the goals would be higher, up, or lower. So the y-axis would represent the bipolar scale, if you still follow. And if you're on top, you're favoring social change. If your answer's at the bottom, then you're favoring social cohesion. And in both contexts, in Hungary and Norway, what we find that there are some people, the blue line, who would, regardless of the action, would always choose social change. So they would volunteer, they would donate money, they would protest in favor of an organization that wants social change. So for them, it's not about the action, it's always about the goal. And there's another group of people, the red line, who would adjust their goal to the action, if you still follow me. So if it's volunteering, donation, blah, 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 social cohesion, then they would do it for individual benefit, social cohesion goals. If it's about political protest, then they would more likely do it for social change. So this gave us an idea that, well, there may be some pattern here that could be meaningful. And rather than seeing all actions as either social change or social cohesion, we need to see it together with the motivations. Okay, and there were some follow-up studies, less nice, and we never published it, but this gave us an idea that there's something here. Okay, that picture got only blurred in our future studies. This is together with Barbara et al. In Porom, where we wanted to look at different kind of, basically, we wanted to test how political discourses that reflect different ideas about intergroup solidarity can predict different action tendencies. We had a very simple view. People who would endorse paternalistic political discourse, so basically it was actually phrased in a very, very paternalistic way. Roma people, in the context of Roma people, sorry, I forgot to mention, Roma people are so helpless, we need to help them. It was actually like quite nasty phrasing. And we thought like people who find this acceptable, they would probably most likely engage in donations, if anything. So we totally the social cohesion line, idea that I would engage in solidarity because it's just so bad for them without challenging anything. And those who would endorse a so-called ally political discourse, which basically said, we all need to stand up against discrimination. So it was very politicized and there was no economic perspective. Those accepting that would predict pro-Roma collective action. Basically, you need to engage in a politicized way to improve the situation of Roma people in your respective countries. And we collected this data on representative samples from 5 European countries: Hungary, Slovakia, Romania, France, and Ireland. And we all adjusted a little bit to the local context, but essentially that was the main question. And Barbara, don't get me wrong, I know this is not the model we published, but I think it fits here better. So basically, okay, anti-Gypsyism, we basically consider it as a control variable because we don't think people are totally prejudiced against the Roma would do anything positive, okay? So forget about the first line. So we tested this, and then what we found, this is all 5 countries, don't worry, you don't have to look at all the specific data, but what we basically found, that our idea of differentiating between paternalistic discourse and ally discourse and how it would predict different outcomes was totally blurred because people just didn't differentiate. Ally discourse predicted donations and pro-Roma action much the same, and accepting paternalistic discourse the same, donations and pro-Roma action about the same much. And they were also very strongly positively correlated. So what we see here, that maybe Roma people who are both economically and politically deprived, it gets totally blurred. So you're either for or against the Roma. It's not about social change versus social cohesion. In a totally different study, but it will still have some relevance to Roma, we wanted to identify the basic psychological motivations of solidarity in Hungarian society. This was on a representative sample 2 years ago. We are actually just repeating this. And we considered conservative ideology as the most basic obstacle to social change, as it would go against ideologies of social hierarchies. So basically, we also thought that that's not part of today's presentation, just for the sake of accuracy. We also thought that national identity fragility may be an important predictor of endorsing such ideologies. So if you think Hungarians are a vulnerable group because of our collective victimhood perspective, or you would have high collective narcissism, believing Hungarians are somehow superior to others and it's somehow not acknowledged our greatness and so on. So this kind of nationalistic idea, but also in a very fragile way, would make people likely to endorse conservative ideologies, especially about social hierarchies, be concerned about any change. So we expected this to be a real obstacle to any kind of cross-group solidarity. But we were also considering and hoping in a way that there could be an alternative path to solidarity, which would be more about social cohesion and the idea that it may be unrelated to conservative ideology, on the basis of a general sense of social responsibility for the well-being of all members of society, which is the classical definition of social cohesion. I won't go into the measures that much, but I just want to say that ideological conservatism were really all mostly related to social groups or group hierarchies. So right-wing authoritarianism, that's more about conventionalism and about, violation of everything that would, violation of our standard or conventional way of living, but also SDO, which is social dominance orientation. That's clearly an ideology about social hierarchies and endorsing these ideas of social hierarchy. And I also want to highlight that we measured solidarity intention through donations and political activism. So already we had in mind of distinguishing between social cohesion oriented and social change oriented action. I'm already telling you, we didn't find any evidence of any kind of distinction, which we are now exploring in our second study, which we are going to collect data for. We try to do it a little bit better. And we didn't ask them a specific group. We said disadvantaged people, and then we asked them, who did you have in mind when we talked about disadvantaged? Okay, so this is what we found overall. Not exactly, but kind of what we expected. National identity fragility very strongly predicted conservative ideology. That's totally not surprising. And then much more weakly, but negatively predicted solidarity. That's how we expected. Moral responsibility was also slightly positively connected to national identity fragility. I don't know how to interpret it. But importantly, this was a strong predictor of solidarity. So kind of an alternative path, a social cohesion path, okay? And people who mentioned the Roma, so it was 1,000 participants, and more than half of them mentioned the Roma when we asked, who do you have in mind when you think of disadvantaged people? We see a much nicer, clearer picture. We have so these 561 people, if we only look at them, we clearly see that there is an ideological path which could become an obstacle to social change. And we see an alternative path which gives us some hope that people may have a moral responsibility to help those in need. When it comes to non-Roma, people who didn't mention Roma, and that's kind of a mix, because there were, poor people, sick people, but some of them mentioned LGBT, so it was kind of a mix, or refugees. It was not completely clear. We try to improve it in our next round, but we do see the ideological path is out. And that's really nice to see the difference, that here we see that through an idea of moral responsibility and totally social cohesion path, there is still some level of potential solidarity in society. It's not related to ideas about hierarchy. So that could be somehow taken into account with interventions. Okay, moving on. Tell me if I have time. No, I have 15 minutes.
Yes, may I have a question regarding
Sure.
this slide? So those people, half of participants or more than a half mentioned the Roma. And whom did these people mention? Was that a mix of groups?
Yeah, kind of a mix. So this was more, and I'm no longer sure why it doesn't add up. Oh yeah, a lot of people didn't write anybody.
Yeah, okay.
And these people, most of them would mention old people, sick people, poor people.
Okay.
The kind of non-politicized art groups, but it's a bit of a mix because some mentioned refugees, some mentioned LGBT people, or just a random whatever, a lot of other stuff.
Okay. Thanks.
But indeed, so this is not connected to ideology. People can, regardless of what they think of social hierarchies, help or not help them, okay? But if there is some level of moral responsibility, they would help them. Okay, so moving on, what we know from so far is that it's kind of blurry, right? We see that the action itself cannot be distinguished, especially when it comes to Roma people, but also other disadvantaged groups. And how about refugees, which is also in a way similar to Roma people in their level of marginalization and political and economic deprivation. And I really love this quote. I think I've used it many times because this is kind of showing how you cannot separate political goals from very simple benevolent volunteering, right? These are people, volunteers all over Europe that made it very, very clear that besides offering food, besides this kind of daily helping behavior, they also want to put pressure on authorities to achieve change. So it's, I think, a nice example that it's not so distinguishable, and especially in countries where authorities treated refugees as enemies, like in Hungary, volunteering itself became a form of expression of political dissent. So we don't know. We wanted to investigate whether people would volunteer with social change motivations or purely based on humanitarian principles, which are not contradictory, of course. Okay, so we did this study with the thousands of respondents. We had over 4,000 respondents, I think, in 2015 refugee crisis. And we asked very typical predictors of collective action. In this case, it's ally collective action, political activism. So we asked them whether they would protest for the rights of refugees, for example, and we found the typical predictors. Opinion-based identity was a pro-refugee identity, and importantly, moral convictions, which is an extension of the Simca model, basically suggesting that in order to engage in a protest, you need to have this conviction that this is morally the only right thing to do. And that's a very, very strong motivator usually. Well, in this case, nothing was really strong, but we found this typical connection, not about efficacy, but which is not surprising because we don't find the role of group efficacy that strong in Hungary ever. But what's important, that is almost identical when it's predicting volunteerism. So the typical behavior you would do to help refugees, it would have the same politicized motivation with the exception of anger, but it's still about considering yourself a pro-refugee supporter, and it's your moral conviction that's the only right way to do it. It's not really different. And for us, this was important to show that the action itself, you choose the adequate action to express your political or moral convictions in a situation. You cannot derive, the outcome from the action you engage in. And then another refugee crisis, the Ukrainian refugees. We collected data in 3 countries, including, again, the same group, Hungarian, Slovakia, and this time Poland. We had very kind of different sample sizes across the countries. I'm just going to show you some evidence. Basically, what we were interested in is whether intentions to engage long-term in helping refugees from Ukraine. We thought that if you have this kind of, well, I call it social cohesion kind of motivations, personal motivations. You don't want to experience the suffering of others. It makes you uncomfortable. You want to improve your kind of self-serving motivations, but the idea that everybody needs to have some benefits or we need to ensure the well-being of everybody. Versus having really politicized motivations. You're out there because you think it's outrageous, the war in Ukraine, and you condemn Putin's actions, etc. And what we found, and we called it, well, conditionality of helping. I later renamed it, but it's really having these stereotypical expectations that refugees should be nice and help and grateful and poor, and they should be very happy for being helped. We thought that people who would have these social cohesion type of motivations, that they would be very frustrated when refugees are not living up to the expectations, and that would keep them to engage in long-term helping, because it's bound to be very frustrating after a while, because refugees tend to be very diverse and not necessarily fitting this. So it creates a conditionality to helping, which could then become an obstacle to long-term pro-social action. But more importantly, we thought that if your motivation is mainly politicized or moral, as a matter of fact, this would be in Slovakia and Poland, we found it was a direct predictor of long-term engagement. It wasn't connected to this conditionality idea, but it's important that if you're out there for political reasons, well, in Hungary it was through conditionality only, but our theorizing was about this, that it doesn't matter what refugees are really like, because you understand that refugees are refugees because of the terrible situation, the war in their home country. And that would, these politicized motivations that we could call social change, I know it's a bit of a strong stretch, would predict long-term pro-social action, and we found some evidence for that. Okay, but still, the question that it still remains quite blurry. Okay, and finally, the one study which gives us some really nice supportive evidence that we have an understanding that these two things can be separated from motivations to actions was in the context of LGBT people. So we expected that those people who perceive LGBT people as moral, as this being the most stereotypical accusation, would, so if they think LGBT people are okay people, they can be moral, or like morally positively viewed, then they would feel sorry for them, or they would have some empathy with them for all the discrimination they are experiencing, and that would at least predict support for some minimal rights, like to live without discrimination, not to be bullied in schools. Okay, so we identified, or we expected this kind of minimal social cohesion path among people with different ideologies and so on. And on the other hand, we thought if people consider the treatment of LGBT people as unjust, well, of course, completely unrelated to the perception of the group, that would make them angry, and that would make them support, or that would predict support for equal political representation and equal rights. So we wanted to identify these two paths. First of all, for the first time, we find some empirical evidence that these action intentions can indeed be separated. They're highly correlated, but the two-factor model had better fit to the data than the one-factor model, basically meaning that if you just say pro-LGBT actions versus separately this minimal non-discrimination action and support for political rights, so social cohesion orientation versus social change orientation, that's a better fit to the data than putting it all together. So we were quite happy with that. And our results, and this is just one of the studies, but we have multiple studies supporting this general idea. Finally, we found that those people who perceive LGBT people more moral are more likely to have this social cohesion path, basically supporting them to live without discrimination. So it becomes a conditional support based on positive perception. Those people who perceive the treatment unjust, they would feel both empathy and anger, and they would support all kinds of rights. So the social cohesion may be a more conditional path, but it exists. And then we did a follow-up study where we distinguished between US participants who are liberal or conservative. And we indeed found that for liberals, it was a whole blurry picture. And for conservatives, we clearly found evidence for the social cohesion path. So this gives us some idea that there could be some stepping stone or some minimal path to solidarity with groups, with any group, at least to the level that they shouldn't be experiencing hostility in society. So this brings me to my final slide, kind of summarizing what we know and what we don't know based on these 10 years of kind of random experiments or surveys. One is that social cohesion and social change-oriented solidarity often co-occur and cannot be separated. Okay, we knew some of that. There was never doubt about that they co-occur, but sometimes they co-occur so much that they are indistinguishable. We see that social justice motivations and empathy can serve both. So people who have both would engage in both types of actions. But social cohesion is also there, but it's much more conditional. Conditional on the target group, conditional on the ideologies, and so on. And we also find that the pattern is not identical for in different intergroup contexts, so it's target group specific what we find. And social change is often just a reflection of much higher involvement, so not this minimal involvement. What we don't know whether social cohesion is a stepping stone for social change. So those people in this LGBT study by my PhD student Patricia Csordas, we don't know if these conservatives of the people who, have on the top path would ever also support equal rights. In fact, we don't even know if they're antagonistic to social change, which has been the kind of predominant social psychological approach to social cohesion. They could be right, but I'm not sure. Is this a continuum of intentions or actions? We don't really know from this. Whether their relationship varies by context, I mean, we kind of think it is the case, but we don't know exactly whether it's really based on purely economical versus political differences. And we don't really know if all the difference is ideologically rooted. We have reasons to doubt that ideology is extremely important, but that may not be the sole difference. So, yeah, for some in the studies, if you think about it, the Roma and refugee context, it was much less clear. And for the LGBT context, it was much clearer. But that doesn't mean that we can immediately draw the conclusion based on the differences of these specific target groups. Okay. So this brings me to the end. And this picture was taken in my son's school. It's a very nice school. It was a bake sale that was organized for supporting teacher strike. We wanted all kinds of political actions, like parents signing petitions and so on, because we had a huge issue about how teachers were no longer allowed to go on strike. So some of them were fired, others didn't get salaries. And it was very hard to motivate the parents to do anything, although we knew everybody was outraged. And then we came up with this idea of organizing a bake sale and giving the income to the strike fund. And we got so many cakes that we had to extend the bake sale to 2 days. And if you think about it, signing a petition takes zero effort. Baking a cake costs money, time, and competence, whatever. But people were so enthusiastic to help. And so that's why I wanted to say that's a very, very benevolent action for a political goal. But this was a kind of repressing system. Parents were afraid if they sign a petition, it could, some of them explicitly said they are worried about their workplace. Others were just worried that it could reflect badly on their kid in the school itself. So there could be all kinds of contextual factors why people choose one form of action or not. But this was clearly a political cause with a very benevolent action. And I think it kind of shows that we need to understand the connection much better than we know at the moment. So thank you.
Mm-hmm.